If you're a pop culture junkie who loves TV, film, music, comedy, and other really important stuff, then you've come to the right place. Get ready and settle in for Classic Conversations, the best pop culture interviews in the world. That's right, we circled the globe so you don't have to. If you're ready to be the king of the water cooler, then you're ready for Classic Conversations with your host, Jeff Dwoskin.
All right, Sadie, thank you so much for that amazing introduction. You get the show going each and every week, and this week was no exception. Welcome, everybody, to episode 316 of Classic Conversations. As always, I am your host, Jeff Dwoskin. Great to have you back for what's sure to be the Beatleistic episode of all ages. Oh my goodness, Chris Carter is here. That's right, Chris Carter, host of Breakfast with the Beatles on Sirius XM. He knows everything about the Beatles. We're talking Beatles. This is chock full of Beatles. And that's coming up in just a few seconds. Last week, John Beckerman and Michaela Watkins, episode 314 and 315. That's right, there was a bonus episode. Dinner with the Parents. We talked all about that and various other things in each of those episodes. Check it out. Love that show. Still love it. Anyway, definitely check it out. But right now, we're going to take a magical mystery tour with Chris Carter. Enjoy. All right, everyone. I'm excited to introduce my next guest. Music, film producer, disc jockey. Do you consider yourself as a disc jockey still?
I think I would be a DJ. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'll go with it.
Based in LA, recognized by BAM, one of the top 100 most influential Californians in music history in the music industry. Host of Breakfast with the Beatles. Welcome to the show, Chris Carter. Oh, founding member of Dramarama.
That's right. We can't forget that.
Can't forget
Dramarama. How you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing great. Normally I would have by default started binging Beatles songs to prepare, talk to a Beatle expert and historian such as yourself. But I realized I've listened to a million Beatles songs in my life. There's nothing so I ended up listening to Dramarama.
There you go.
There you go.
Fine alternative.
Yeah, it was, so I wanted to do just Cinema Verite. Breakfast with Dramarama for a second. It's a cool background. You have like this awesome background.
Oh, yeah. It's pretty cool in here. This is just
I don't even mean your studio. I mean like your background, but other than.
Oh, I thought you meant my back. I work hard
too, that, but.
Your background is nice as well. Yeah.
No, I mean like you had a band. I mean, not just a band. I mean, it's not like it's like when you read someone's history and they're like, oh, he was in a band. You were on the Letterman. You were on Dennis Miller's show. I mean, you were on MTV. You were like, this was some.
We were a real band. Yeah.
I mean, it was like, you've always been fascinated with music?
Yeah, since I was a little kid. I guess it was 1967 would be the pivotal year for me as a 7-year-old. Just started listening to AM radio like all kids my age, I guess, pre-FM. And I got hooked. It was something that made me feel different. When I heard Incense and Peppermints from the Strawberry Alarm Clock for the first time, it made you feel cool. And I liked that feeling. It just stayed with me. And I graduated high school and went to college for 1 year for business because I wanted to open a record store. And then I quit college and I opened a record store. So I didn't have to finish the other 3 years because I said, why do I need to do? I already know what I want. So we started a record store in Wayne, New Jersey, where I grew up, me and a buddy in 79, kept it till about 1982. We started the band Dramarama in the basement of that record store. That's kind of where it started, where music became like, a profession, so to speak, instead of just something I liked private.
That's awesome. Looney Tunes Records, your record store. These days, my favorite thing to do is go to a used record store. It's really the only place where you can kind of just immerse yourself in that old school music store and kind of just surround yourself with music and kind of just feel the music, just go through it, look at all the different things, discover things that you otherwise would never have discovered, or, oh, what album is this?
Yeah. And the fact that you can, look at albums, it became, once CDs entered the picture, it kind of changed everything, And I always say to everybody, what they should have done was they should have kept the concept of the 12-inch, the big album cover, and then just put the CD inside the album. Because what happened was when they did the big transfer, all the record stores had these big bins, like in Looney Tunes records, we had bins that you'd look at there. And once CDs came along, all those bins, they had to get rid of them. And it was kind of, like starting from scratch again, just so we can put these CD racks in. And it always bugged me because once you got the CD, as everybody knows, you couldn't read anything anymore. You were looking at everything with a magnifying glass. All the artwork that you loved so much was just shrunk down. Now, they should have just kept the size, just stuck the CD in the album like they do now. They do that. Buy box sets and you get the full album cover, and then they have these little slips for the CDs. No one thought of that back in 1986.
It's a great idea, and they could have then reused all the same.
Well, they would have not had all the Sam Goodies and all the Tower records, and they got rid of all those bins, which was the primary way you would buy music. It was very costly, to make that transfer. Now, where are we at? Now you're back to buying records at Whole Foods next to the broccoli, you buy Sgt. Pepper for $35, while you're checking out with your almonds.
I remember when the shift to CDs was happening, and CDs were expensive, like really expensive. And so I remember like my collection at that time would have been like greatest hits albums, unless it was like a killer album, like Fleetwood Mac Rumors or something like that.
Right.
You would buy the greatest hits because couldn't afford to buy a lot of them.
How about, do you remember blank CDs? Like when I was in a band, right? Back in the day, we would do a mix of a song and we want it on CD. We want to take it home. It was $25 for a blank one CD. I was like, oh, let's all chip in for the blank CD. Now it's the penny. I mean, that's a real turnaround, if you will. Nothing ever, I can't think of one item that was $25 at one time and now is a penny. It's really hard to think of anything that really had that reduction in cost.
I remember vividly buying one of my very first computers. So, late 80s or whatever. I don't know, and having to decide, do you want to put a CD player on this computer? It was an option. Not everyone had it.
Right.
And then, of course, that became standard. And now they don't have CD players anymore.
You can't buy a car with a CD player anymore. You can't even order them. Like if you try to order them, I'm sorry, you can't even order them. They don't want you to have them, which is really odd because any box set that comes out, no matter who, if you want the Fleetwood Mac box set, if you want the Yes box set, they're all on CD. That's the remixing and the remastering is still done on CD. Of course, you can get the vinyl, but so it's a weird time in the era of purchasing music. You really don't know how to also count sales. When I looked at when Now and Then by the Beatles came out, that new song, I was looking at all the charts to see how it was charting, to see if it was going to, get to number one or whatever. And I looked at the Billboard singles charts the week that Now and Then came out, and the top 10 songs, 8 of them were by Taylor Swift. And I thought I was looking at the wrong chart. I go, this must be the streaming chart. This can't be the Hot 200 single. And it was. So that's the other thing is, how do you count sales now? Because you have streaming, you have downloads, you have vinyl, you have CDs. How do you? It's a tricky thing to determine.
It's an interesting world. A couple of years ago, my daughter went to a concert and they mailed her the artist's new CD. And she gets it in the mail and she looks at me and goes, "Dad, what am I supposed to do with this?" It's interesting. Well, you brought up two things. So Taylor Swift. I think Taylor Swift is the closest to the Beatles now than there's been. It seems that you got every generation loving her, multiple generations. She's just a powerhouse.
The only reason I would say maybe not exactly is the way you're marketed now, in that the Beatles kind of got where they were solely on the music and, the image that they had, the quick image that you saw pictures in a movie. Now with the TikTok world that we live in this, it's a whole nother way to garner a huge audience. And sometimes I wonder, would she have the kind of numbers she has if she was doing it the old school way? Like if she was around in the 70s, say, would she have this kind of, mass these kind of numbers that she racks up, because it's incredible when you look at the numbers. I think if the Beatles were around today with the same audience, I think they could have maybe surpassed that. If you were playing by the same rules, like if the Beatles were on TikTok and you were looking at I Want to Hold Your Hand and the Ed Sullivan was, streamed through billion houses, it's a different way to rack up your sales. But I don't want to take anything away from her. She's definitely unique in the fact that she just racks up numbers like nobody else really quite comes close to this. And she's doing something that the Beatles kind of did, and that's she has a very young audience, and then she has an older audience that still likes her. People always say, well, how are the Beatles so big? And I always say, well, because 7-year-olds and 17-year-olds like them at the same time, which is unheard of, because anything a 7-year-old usually likes, especially artistically, like music. Someone who is 17, you'd be hard-pressed to say, well, they like the same thing a 7-year-old would like. But in the case of the Beatles, they really checked off all those boxes. And then the adults also understood the talent there, too. Yeah, so in that respect, I think she's somewhat close. And she's not a group either. She's a person. So that's kind of removes her from that kind of competition against the Beatles as well.
Yeah, I don't mean competition. I wasn't trying to phrase. I just mean.
I know what you mean, but the sales, the numbers.
I just mean phenomenon.
Well, the Beatles never had 8 out of 10 songs in the top 10. But again, that's based differently. It's based on.
Oh, right. But yeah, how things are distributed now is different too. Yeah. You can't compare.
Yeah.
The general feeling. I was going to bring up now and then. I was going to ask you how you must be really excited that group finally got their act together and put out a new song.
About time. Tell you. Well, people always say, well, what do you think about that song? Do you love it? Do you think it's... The first thing I always say is, I don't think when John was writing it, he ever intended it to be a single, which was released it's a definite album track, if anything. And I think if it was an album track and it was sitting on, side 2, 4th song in, I think it would have been one of people's favorite songs. It's like Sexy Sadie or Cry Baby Cry. They weren't hit singles, but they were great album tracks. And I think of it like that. John just wrote that song. I don't think he visioned it as a single, but it was released as a single. So everybody, looking at it like a single. When people release singles, usually they're the more catchy song on a record or the most, you could, has the most cross section of an audience. So it was put in a weird position. Here's a song John was working on, and now, it's released as a Beatles single. I don't know if that would have sat well with John. He would have been like, what are you kidding? That was, But with that said, it's pretty awesome. The whole trilogy of Free as a Bird, Real Love, and now this song, is pretty mind blowing if you just think about it. The 3 of the Beatles got together and did that in the first place.
I love the whole story behind this song, which was part of those 2 songs.
Yeah. George didn't like it at all. George was not a big fan of the song, which is why they kind of scrapped it. Not to get into, inside the world of the Beatles, but I think when the 3 of them got back together, I think George being probably the most difficult of the 3, to want to get back together and relive the old days of the lads. I think, one of George's things was let's bring in Jeff Lynne to the picture, because George works very closely with Jeff Lynne. And you'll notice now that George has left us, Jeff Lynne wasn't really involved with this one. It was kind of Paul in the driver's seat, Giles Martin in that group. So point is, George carried some weight with the 3 of them when they got back together. And I think they were kind of not walking on eggshells around George, but definitely they knew he was the guy who would probably be the most least into it, I should say. And so having Jeff Lynne there, I think, was a plus for George, and he felt more comfortable. So, now that George wasn't here, Paul thought, let's do it. And one of the more interesting things about that song is that there was a bridge in the song that Paul and Ringo, I guess you could say, took out, which was an interesting call, because if you were familiar with it, you kind of miss it when you hear it not being there. And then the last thing I want to say about that is some of the cover versions, you could go on and find, a 1964 rendition. And there's a group called Apple Jam, who are a good Beatle tribute band. They did a a version of Now and Then about a month before it was really released by the Beatles. And I was playing it a little bit. And it's really good because it's a lot more melodic. You know, they made it a little more Beatlesque than the actual Beatles did it, which is interesting.
I didn't know there were other versions. And
Oh, yeah, there's 2 or 3. Yeah. Look, just go on YouTube and Google Now and Then. You'll find them. There's like a couple of them. But one of them in particular is really good.
I had heard that you had mentioned that it was sort of like, well, okay, with George had passed away. I had heard that it was because of the AI technology, because John had recorded it over piano and they were finally able to remove the vocal from the music and then create the full recording from it.
Yeah, that's what they did. Yeah. But they took out this part of the song that was in there.
Where can we find that part of the song?
You can go on YouTube and just type in Now and Then the Beatles, and you could hear the original John Lennon version.
Okay. All right. This is good.
Yeah.
I was really taken by that song. I got the single right there on vinyl. I bought it. I loved it. I loved it. And it was funny because when I'm driving and listening to it, I'm like, oh, this is going to be used in every montage where they show people that passed away.
Right. Yeah, the year end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there was just something about it that was a nice, I thought it was great that they had a track from George. So that was nice. So they could legit say it was all 4 of them because they had done it way back then. I thought it was a nice,
Yeah, Paul did his bass part over again,
I thought it was a nice, just kind of end cap.
Yeah, it's a fine song, without a doubt. And it's one of those songs that also grows on you. You think about the first time you heard it and then how you feel now. And it takes time, songs take time, especially something like this where everybody wants an instant reaction. What do you think of the new Beatles song? And it's like, give me, talk to me in a month. It's true. Songs, you have to get into them a little bit. They have to become a part of your life. It's not instantaneous. It's not like a meal. It's like,
right. Some hit you right away.
Yeah, some do. And usually if you like it in the beginning, you might not like it as much later.
Yeah. It's the same thing with sometimes TV shows, movies. Totally.
Yeah.
You gotta sleep on it a little bit.
Exactly.
Sorry to interrupt. Have to take a quick break. Do want to thank everyone for their support of the sponsors. When you support the sponsors, you're supporting us here at Classic Conversations, and that's how we keep the lights on. And now back to my conversation with Chris Carter. So before the Beatles, again, there was Dramarama. And
there was Dramarama before.
And so you're a big LA band. When you broke up, I actually want to hear more about the VH1 reunion.
Yeah, that was an interesting event. They had a show called Bands Reunited, but they didn't tell us that when they first pitched it to me. This guy, Richard Blade, who was a DJ on K-Rock, and he's now on Sirius XM. He said, Chris, we're doing a show called Most Influential Bands of the 80s. And I was like, oh, wow. How nice. We'll finally get some recognition. Influential bands of the 80s. Yeah, great. Can I get, the band members' addresses and phone numbers? I was like, sure. So I helped him out. And like a couple of weeks later, I'm doing Breakfast with the Beatles on a Sunday morning. I'm alone at this radio station, as you are on a Sunday morning at a radio station. And I look up at the little camera, and in the lobby, there's like 10 guys with cameras and boom mics. I'm like, what the hell's this on a Sunday morning? I'm wearing cutoff shorts and like a Hawaiian shirt. No one sees you when you go. I just roll out of bed. So we let them in, and it's Richard Blade and the camera crew from VH1. And we're doing a show called Bands Reunited. And Chris, will you get back together with your band? And they put you on the spot and put a microphone in front of you. And I'm thinking this whole time, this guy told me we're on a show called Most Influential Bands of the 80s. And now it's a show called Bands Reunited. And I'm like, what happened? And all this had going through my head at the same time. So they put the mic in front of you, and the concept of the show is they go up to all the members of these bands that have been broken up, and each person has to say that they would get back together. So I'm like, well, I got to think about it, because I was like mad at the guy for kind of lying to me. But of course I said yes. And long story short, we had been broken up for, I guess, 10 years at the time. So we get all back together with the original guys. And then they ask you to play a concert with your band that got reunited. They don't pay you a penny, by the way. So you have to get back together with guys that you kind of all, yet I don't think we ever had real falling out. We were all still friends, but it's a little uncomfortable. You're getting back together with the guys that you hadn't seen in all these years. And then you have to put on a concert at the Roxy, which is sold out, right? Because it's a big thing, K-Rock concert, back Dramarama. So you have to be good. You haven't played in 10 years, so you have to put on a concert. So they're putting all this pressure on you, right? You have to get back with your friends that you haven't talked to. You have to learn a set. You have to a whole show's worth of songs, basically. And they don't give you any money. Looking back on it, I don't think I would have done it again, you know?
Sounds like a dream come true.
It was good for them, you know, but it wasn't that fun. It was a lot of work, really, but it was kind of cool, I guess.
And then the band's still together now. I mean, not with you, but
yeah, no. There's 3 guys that are still together and they're playing, and I keep in touch with the lead singer John Easdale still, and we're still friends. We're all still friends. It's all good.
Well, you got like 0.00005 cents coming your way because I just listened to your album on Amazon.
Yeah, I don't understand any of that, how you get paid for streaming, and I have no idea. I know we've had like over 1 million streams for this one song. I don't know what that gets you. I saw the Beatles had 72 million streams of Now and Then, and they made $42,000 from that. Doesn't sound right.
No, yeah.
But that's about, I think the point is that's how little you make.
You do not make a lot. Do you still manage the Wonderments?
No.
Okay.
No, after Dramarama broke up, I managed a couple of bands, the Wonderments, who went on to become Brian Wilson's backup band, and another band called Baby Lemonade, and another band called The Negro Problem. And they all went on to do really cool things. Stu from The Negro Problem did a musical on Broadway with Spike Lee, and they all ended up doing what they dreamt of. Like the Wonderments were big time Beach Boys fans, and they ended up being Brian Wilson's band. And this band Baby Lemonade were big Arthur Lee and Love fans, and they became Love. So if you go see Love now, you original members and Baby Lemonade. So that was fun. Then I made a movie about Rodney Bingenheimer, who is a DJ on K-Rock. Now he's on Sirius XM with me in Little Steven's Underground Garage on Sunday nights. So I made that movie about Rodney, which took about 7 years to make.
Mayor of the Sunset Strip.
You ever see that, Mayor of the Sunset Strip?
No, I haven't seen it, but I came across that. I got that to watch now and search on all the other Now and Then versions.
Yeah. You'll have fun with all of that. Yeah, the Mayor of the Sunset Strip is an interesting rock and roll movie. Everybody's in it. It's like Rodney was such a pivotal figure that it was really easy to get all these people in the movie. And it's directed by a guy named George Hickenlooper, who passed away. And George had directed Hearts of Darkness, The Making of Apocalypse Now, which was one of the greatest documentaries of all time. It was almost better than Apocalypse Now because you got to see, all the crazy stuff that happened. So when I wanted to make this movie about Rodney, I wanted to get a director who was great at documentaries, but who knew nothing about rock and roll. I didn't want to get a rock and roll guy. I wanted to get someone who didn't know about rock and roll so he could look at it from another point of view. And then I told him, I said, we can get anybody in the world in this movie. And he's like, really? I go, yeah, we can. And we ended up doing just that. Cher is in the movie, David Bowie's in the movie, Courtney Love, the Ramones, Alice Cooper. I mean, you can't name anybody in rock, that's not in this movie. Oasis, Gwen Stefani, it doesn't matter. Everybody's in this movie. Sadly, he passed away after he made a movie with Kevin Spacey. That was weird. So, yeah. Then after all that, I started hosting Breakfast with the Beatles. So I had a little management stint, little movie making. And now I've been doing this for 22 years.
Amazing. Before Breakfast with the Beatles, you were on air talent for a while, right? Before that, right?
Yeah. I had a couple of shows. Yeah.
Where's the love? I mean, obviously, I love the Beatles. Everyone loves the Beatles. Well, I should ask you, when someone comes up to you and says, really, the Beatles? How do you even handle that? Do you have a face that you have prepared when someone comes up to you and says that they really don't like the Beatles?
I never really get them. I don't get a lot of that, honestly. I don't get a lot of people telling me they don't like the Beatles. They probably wouldn't come up to me to say that, if anything.
Right, unless they wanted to cause trouble.
Yeah, they try to argue with me. But I can understand, how someone might not like the Beatles. Usually it's someone who didn't grow up in that era. It's hard. You're hard pressed to find someone who grew up then. But there were a few that didn't like the Beatles.
Right.
It's interesting, though, that the young people, that the amount of young people that still like the Beatles and buy Beatles stuff is so incredibly high. I mean, the requests I get on the Beatles channel, I'd say half of them are people under 40. which blows my mind, because I'm thinking we're always just playing, right? Everybody out there is 65 and over, but it's not the case. Again, that's why the Beatles were here and everybody else was here, and I always use the same example. If you go see Paul McCartney in concert now, you'll see a given row of people. You'll see a family with kids. You'll see an old, hippie in a tie-dye t-shirt. You'll see a cross-section of every age. And that's what the Beatles did. And if you go see, say, the Rolling Stones, you don't see that. You don't see kids singing along to the Stones songs. It's not a family thing. Paul kind of carries that torch of what made the Beatles so universal. And again, they just had this cross-section of fans that nobody else really had.
Now that you mention it, like the one concert that I saw with my dad twice was Paul McCartney. It would have been Flowers in the Dirt era.
Right, yeah. Dad doesn't take you to see the Stones, You know what I mean? It's just because it's the same thing carried on.
But I did go see the Stones though.
But not with Dad.
And the reason not with my dad. And the reason I did was because I was like, oh, they're old. They're probably gonna give this up soon. And that was Steel Wheels.
Yeah. Hey, I have a documentary from the Stones 75, 76 tour, right? They're out some big stage in Philadelphia. And the guy's on the news. He's on the stage in the afternoon. And he's like, in 2 hours from now, Mick Jagger, 36-year-old Mick Jagger, will be running up and down the stage for 2 hours, ladies and gentlemen, at 36. And that was like a big deal. Like, wow, this guy is old. If they only knew that same guy would be running up and down that same stage at 80. I mean, the new Stones record that Paul plays bass on, the song that Paul plays bass on is like a Sex Pistols song. I mean, it's a raging piece of rock and roll. It's like, and to think that there's two guys in their 80s on that song, and Keith Richards, who's 79. And I think it kind of proves that rock and roll really it's kind of ageless in that if you can still sing, it's really not hard to play guitar. It doesn't matter how old you are. It's really just, you see it. These guys can still play guitar. Jimmy Page, those guys still play great. It's something I don't think anybody ever really thought would be happening at this point. I mean, even Aerosmith, you go see Aerosmith live, and they're like, if you're from like halfway back, it looks and sounds just like Aerosmith in 1979. It's like Steven Tyler still has the exact same moves. And how old is he? He's got to be he's 70 something, right? I mean, it's incredible.
Keeps him young. Nobody
thought that these guys would be able to do this, at this point. I mean, even Kiss, those guys, they just played their last show at the Garden. And, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, they're still on these heels that are sick. I mean, Paul Stanley's on 6-inch heels and he's still jumping around like that. It's quite amazing to think about.
It is. It's absolutely incredible.
The sad thing is in the next 10 years, they're all going to die. It's so freaky because...
Well, sure, now that you put it out there.
Well, yeah, like I'm keeping them alive. No, you know what I mean? You got Paul and Ringo, Mick and Keith, Ray and Dave from the Kinks, and Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey, all your senior class of the British invasion. They're all, they're not going to get into their late 90s. These guys have probably, and they're all going to go in succession. It's going to be really weird. Dylan, they're all going to go like within a couple of years. And I know I don't want to bring you down.
Stop, you're making it so sad.
It's true, though. You just do the math. It's like all these guys are still with us, right?
Oh, I know.
It's going to be like a kind of a snowball effect, I'm afraid.
Age is a bitch, and it's going to get us all. Nothing else gets us. Age is going to... Speaking of which, is Paul dead already?
Yeah, they've had a new guy since 1967. I don't know why that's such a hard thing to understand. Yeah, the guy with the mustache on Sgt. Pepper, not Paul.
Now, that's impressive when we were talking earlier about the time. Like, for something like that, to like a conspiracy theory like that to spread, to become part of pop culture before internet. I grew up knowing this as well. Paul's dead. A DJ discovered. Play this backwards.
There was a great magazine that came out that I just got a new copy of, actually. I think it's right here. Paul is dead. Is it here? No. I thought it was right handy, but it's not. It's a whole thick magazine about every clue about Paul being dead. It's great.
Right. They're supposed to be like on certain album covers and lyrics and like Strawberry
Yeah.
Fields Forever
Yeah.
and backward messages. I'm so tired. What? I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, Paul is dead. Paul is dead. Yeah. That's part of, I think, what keeps the mystique alive too, is all that kind of cool stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was fun. Like you said, before the internet, you could get away with things like that for a longer period of time.
Exactly. All right. So when did you fall in love with the Beatles to make it your life? Because, I mean, other than your British Invasion show where maybe you pull in a couple of songs from The Who or whatever, you are nonstop Beatles. And I mean, there's only so many Beatles songs. So, but I mean, when you get
I do 60 a day, Jeff. I have to put together a 60 song playlist every day, 80 on the weekends. Actually, I do 8 shows a week. I do Monday through Friday on the Beatles channel. Then I do the British Invasion Saturday and Sunday. Then I do a live version of Breakfast with the Beatles on KLOS in Los Angeles, which is what I've been doing for 22 years.
Right, that's the extension of like the original run, right?
Yeah, right, exactly, which has been on 40 years here in Los Angeles. So we just had our 40th anniversary of the show that I took over from Deirdre O'Donoghue, who was the original host. Yeah, no, my love for the Beatles, it makes the job easier when you're dealing with, like you said, there's almost 200 songs, give or take. And the majority of them, I'm hard pressed to pick more than like 3 or 4 really bad Beatles songs. There really aren't any. A couple of covers, Till There Was You, singing about wonderful roses and things like that. Obviously that's not a highlight necessarily of the Beatles canon of songs. But other than that, I mean, you're dealing with a level of quality that is, unsurpassed, basically. And they're great for radio, most of these songs, because they're all short. And you realize up until Ticket to Ride, which came out in 65, that was the first Beatles song over 3 minutes long. So every song up until Ticket to Ride was under 3 minutes. I mean, think about that for a minute. That's it's incredible to get that much in. It shows you the talent of their songwriting. In and out, verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus out, 2 minutes and 34 seconds. It's not easy.
Of like the 213 songs, I think I read. I don't like throwing out stats in front of you because you. Like 24 of them were cover songs, roughly.
Yeah, okay. Give or take, yeah.
Give or take. How rich are those people? Because
that was what I always talk about, like Larry Williams, right? Who's just this guy who made records in the late 50s, never had any real big hits, right? All of a sudden, the Beatles start covering your songs. We always call it mailbox money. It's a lot of mailbox money for the Williams family because the Beatles are, covered 3 of this guy's songs, 3 Larry Williams songs. Imagine that surprise going to the mailbox every quarter to get your royalty check. Beatles are covering your song. It's incredible, Yes.
I was talking to Jeff Sherman, whose father was one of the Sherman brothers.
Yeah.
And Cyndi Lauper, She's So Unusual, was actually a cover of He's So Unusual. And all of a sudden, I don't think it was his father that wrote it. It might have been whatever. But all of a sudden, so much money started coming in.
It's incredible. And especially when you're talking Beatles money.
Yeah.
It's one thing to have, a hit on an album or whatever. But when you're talking Beatle money, it's incredible. And it's worldwide, too. It's not just in America. Those records are sold all over the world. So it must have been an amazing turnaround for a guy like Larry Williams, who really never had probably made any kind of big time royalties. Chuck Berry is a different story. Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, those guys were used to mailbox money. But Larry Williams, that was like, oh, wow. Made him a happy man. I think he died in the 80s. So he had time to spend money.
Died in 1980 at age 44. Died young.
Yeah. I'm always amazed by a lot of the ages. A lot of these guys, died at 47, from, liver disease. It's like guys who died in their 40s. It's like, wow.
Oh, man. Yeah. So, all right. Sad story with Larry Williams. We won't get into that.
Yeah. It's a whole thing.
Yeah. So, all right. So your love for the Beatles. Do you remember like hearing the Beatles for the first? What was your first Beatles album that you got?
Rubber Soul.
It was
the first album I ever owned. First Beatle album was the first album I ever owned. Got it at ShopRite, which was a food store for $3.49. I don't know why my mom let me have it. I didn't know any of the songs on it because none of those songs were on the radio. The Rubber Soul that came out in America, there were no singles on it. So I just knew it was the Beatles, and I knew that they were the Beatles. And that was it. That was my door into the Beatles. And it's still my favorite album of all their albums, the American Rubber Soul. I'm not a big fan of the American albums as much as British ones, but that one is perfect. I think that's the perfect Beatles album.
All right, that's a perfect segue for my next question, because I knew you could answer this to me. That's the one thing I just never understood. What UK albums, US albums?
It's simple. The record label they were on in England was Parlophone. They were owned by EMI. In America, they needed a record label. The intention was to put them on Capitol Records, but they didn't like them in 1963, the people in America. So they put them on VJ Records, which was just a cheap Chicago label, right? Yeah, interestingly, another inside the Beatles kind of thing. In Canada, the Beatles records were on Capitol in 1963 when they weren't on Capitol in America. They were on VJ. So in Canada, Capitol said you could, so the orange yellow swirl on those 45s, they were out in 63 in Canada, which a lot of people don't know. But getting back to it, what happened was the American market was viewed differently than the British market. Capitol Records, it was their job to put out the Beatles records. So in England, you had Please Please Me was their first record, and those songs were on introducing the Beatles on VJ, so Capitol didn't want those songs. The next Beatle album, the second Beatle album in England, was With the Beatles, which has got that cover of all four of them. That's like Meet the Beatles. And that is where they took the majority of the songs for what became the Beatles' first album in America on Capitol, which is Meet the Beatles. And they ignored that VJ record because it was on a crappy label that the Beatles weren't on. The Beatles signed a deal with Capitol, and they gave VJ a deal like, by the end of 64, you can't put out any more Beatle records because they're big and we were stupid for not signing them, but now we're smart and we signed them, so you guys are done. So then it became the job of Capitol Records to take what the Beatles were doing in England and then try to put it out in America. And they already had two different albums out in England, so it was confusing. So they said, let's just make our own album to introduce everyone to the Beatles. And that was Meet the Beatles. And then it became a vicious cycle. In other words, the next time, let's make another Beatles record. That last one was a hit. We'll call it the Beatles' second album. And that was songs made up from the next Beatles album. So they would take songs from the real albums that the Beatles put out. And the Beatles put out records very calmly and orderly. If you look at the British releases, in 1963, it was Please Please Me and With the Beatles. 1964, it's very simple. A Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale. 1965, Help and Rubber Soul. But in America, in that same period of time I just said, you got the Beatles' second album, you got the Beatles' six, you got all these Beatle albums that were taking songs from one album and putting them on the next. We didn't know this in America. Kids in America just thought it was the new Beatles record. It wasn't until the CDs came out in the 80s that we saw, what was going on. Like, oh, it's a lot easier to understand. They only made two records a year, and here they are. In America, they were just gunning these records out all over the place. And the Beatles would come to play. They never knew what to say. They would say, this record is from Beatles 9. They would just make up titles because they didn't know the early Beatles, the Beatles 6, Beatles' second album. It was confusing. Something new. All these album titles. And you're like, what's going on? To really understand it, once they got up to Sgt. Pepper, that was the first time that they put out the same record in England as it was in America. No more nonsense. No more of this. Because if you look at some of these American records like Revolver, right? The Revolver I got when I was a kid. There's only two John Lennon songs on it. So you got a Beatle album with the leader of the Beatles only singing two songs on the American Revolver. George Harrison sings 3 songs on the American Revolver. George sings more songs than John on a Beatles album. It's crazy because those are the songs that they picked for us to hear at Capitol Records. And I'll leave you with one more crazy thing. The Beatles' second album, it's called the Beatles' second album. Paul McCartney only sings one song on it, Long Tall Sally. The whole album, Paul sings one song. And again, this was created by Capitol, which is insane. How could Paul sing one song on a Beatles album? But we didn't know any better. We bought them. So that was the deal with the Capitol versus parlophone releases, England versus America. So it got all cluttered up. And then in America, they would put singles out that weren't singles, 8 days a week. Wasn't a single in England. The Beatles didn't want it to be a single, but they wanted it to be a single in America, so they put it out. They wanted Ringo to sing a song, so Matchbox was a single. Crazy stuff. But that helped break them. The Beatles couldn't get mad at him because it made them million. Those odd calls by Capitol Records in the 60s made them the biggest selling band as well. So you can kind of look back at it and say, it was kind of a screwy choice of releasing albums that way. But they would come back and say, but they were all number one, so I guess we knew what we were doing. There you have it.
There you have it. Sorry to interrupt. I have to take another quick break, and we're back. You mentioned something real quick, and I had talked to, I'd interviewed Lori Jacobson. She wrote a book called Top of the Mountain about the Shea Stadium.
Yeah, I know her.
One of the things when I was reading that book that I was fascinated with was the fact that Beatles came out. Not everyone liked the Beatles. Not everyone was big fans. And I don't know. I grew up in an age where just everyone loved the Beatles. I don't, you know what I mean? I guess you could have liked the Stones or the Beatles. But
there was a great record called Pop Hates the Beatles, by Alan Sherman. There were some like anti-Beatles novelty records, Stamp Out the Beatles. There were a lot of the boys, a lot of guys didn't like the Beatles because their girlfriends all liked them. They had longer hair. So there was a lot of mad boyfriends in the 60s that
jealousy almost did the Beatles in.
Yeah.
Why do you think the Beatles, besides the multi-generational thing, but I'm sure there's you could point to other similar things, but why are the Beatles still, right? There's the Beatles, there's Stones, there's certain people we still talk about. Why do you think the Beatles are just never went away? When their new song came out, it just became a thing immediately and everyone just fell in love again. And
well, because they were the biggest entertainers in the history of entertainment. So that's a good starting point. Once you're there, you're never going to go away. Once you're Elvis, you're Elvis. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many years you've been dead. He's still Elvis. Though, as time goes on, it is getting scarier where more and more people never heard of Elvis and never heard of the Beatles, and you're starting from there. Whereas at least even if you didn't know all about them, you've heard of them. A lot of people are like, who? That's when it gets scary to me. And, once you lose a couple of generations of people passing this down, which is why I kept saying earlier about all these guys who are going to leave us. See, once they leave you, once Mick and Keith die, the whole Rolling Stones machine stops, okay? As long as they're alive, they keep it going. You see the tongue tour and the thing. Once they're gone, and it happened to Elvis a little bit, because guys from my generation thought, Elvis would always be Elvis, the king. But when you start, like I said, skipping through generations, they started closing down, going to see Graceland, which was open 7 days a week. Now it's open 3 days a week. Or, they had the plane that Elvis did. They took that away because no one was going. As the years go by, less and less interest in Elvis, which is going to happen with everybody. But since Paul and Ringo are here generating, they're still generating business like they were, what I mean? There's Apple and Capitol, and you got the Now and Then record and the red vinyl and the cassette. They're still marketing and they're still pushing it. Once that ends, it'll be interesting to see if the Beatles will always regain, their toppermost of the poppermost status. But the other reason, too, was because they always evolved. So you have this catalog of music. See, a lot of bands kind of, you shoot your load, pardon the expression, but it's over. You do your thing and that's it. The Beatles became a new band every 2 years. You had the Mop Top Beatles of 64 and, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And then you had the folky Beatles, the mature rubber soul. Then you had the psychedelic Beatles. And then you had the White Album. They kept changing, which is the key to their success, which is why they weren't the Dave Clark Five, who, again, by 64, 65, you got the Dave Clark Five. They weren't making a psychedelic album that was blowing your mind. And the Beatles kept going and getting progressively, you could say, better and more interesting. And that's the other reason they have this body of work. Once you have that body of work, you can become timeless. Quentin Tarantino's always going to have a body of work when he's dead or whatever. Alfred Hitchcock has a body of work. You got to have that. You can't just do one or two things really well and that's it and check out and expect to be a legend. You have to have that. And Elvis has that to some degree too. You know, you got the 50s Elvis, you got the 60s movie Elvis, you got the Vegas Elvis. But the Beatles were a group and Elvis was just a guy. So it's a little different.
Right.
More like Taylor. She should start a band. That would be smart.
That would, when you're putting together your list, 60 songs a day,
Yeah.
which is about, of just the core songs, it would be about, because I'm sure we can do covers and solo and all that kind of stuff. But like, do you have any rules? Like,
oh, yeah.
Like you can't do the song that you did yesterday.
Yeah. Well, I have, Monday through Friday rules because I'm considerate of the audience. And I know when you're doing morning drive, as they call it in radio, you're getting people that listen to the same channel at the same time. So I'm very cognizant about playing, And I Love Her in the first hour. Sometimes the first hour I'll be lighter. I'm not going to play Helter Skelter, the first song. I'll ease them into the day. So then you'll find yourself playing similar songs during the first hour. So I try to avoid that. And I always, again, aware of the date. Today, for instance, Yellow Submarine came out in England in 1969. So I mentioned that. And I mentioned, we're a week away from the Beatles arriving in, JFK. And everything this year from 1964 is the 60th anniversary. So this is like a big year for the Beatles. So it's the 60th anniversary for the Ed Sullivan Show. It's the 60th anniversary for the first show in America. It's the 60th anniversary for the Beatles landing in JFK. So you keep all that going in your mind as well. I have all McCartney Mondays. We do 2 for Tuesdays where I pair up songs. I have Spin the Wheel Wednesdays where I have categories on all the wheels. So this all helps me when I'm putting together a playlist to answer your question. Because if you just start with a clean slate, like, okay, 60 songs, gee, you'll be there all day. What am I going to start with? Wait, you have 215 choices plus all the solo records to choose, so you'll be there all day. Should I start with Maybe I'm a Maid? No. Should I start with Sgt. Pepper? No, maybe something older. So I don't do it that way. I just I look at the date. I see what albums came out. I know what I'm doing. I don't play songs that sound ridiculous next to each other. I'm not going to play A Day in the Life and then, I don't know, play Dig It or something. Well, that might sound good because it fades up at the end of the chord. You see, that's it. Like, there'll be the final chord of A Day in the Life. And like, what do I do now? I have this chord. What? Dear Prudence, that fades up. That'll be good. I think of it in terms of, sets. Everything's in sets.
Do you keep all this in your head or do you have like...
All in my head. It's all in my head because I know it so well. I don't have to go listen to how a song ends. Like, you can name a song. I can tell you if it fades out or if it ends cold. I just know it. And then there's the mono versus the stereo mixes. And you also have to consider the fact that, like, say I know everything about the Beatles, right? You don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be the guy who knows everything in it because there's nothing more annoying than somebody who thinks they know everything. So I'm talking to guys like me who know a lot, and I'm also talking to a guy who might have one Beatles album in his collection, like Beatles 1 Greatest Hits. So you have to talk to both of these guys at the same time, the hardcore guy who knows everything and the casual fan. You want to give the right amount, a little bit of tidbit of information that will pacify the hardcore guy and show him that you know what you're talking about. And at the same time, not talk down to someone else. Like, well, if you don't know that the mono mix is, you can't, you want to try to be informative. And then on top of all that, be kind of funny because the Beatles were funny guys and humor was a big part of the Beatles. You never see John Lennon where he's not making camera goes to John, he'll go, he'll make a face, he'll stick his tongue out, he'll do something. So keeping all that in mind, I
will say, if you want feedback, is I listen to your show a lot. And
right.
Just based on what you were saying, what occurred to me is when I would listen to you, and the thing that I loved most about listening to you is that, one, you don't come off like the smartest guy in the world, but
right.
you clearly know a lot. You always sounded just as excited to say it for the first time. You sounded
right.
like you were saying it for the first time every time. Like you were just so excited to share this information that you just got. And like,
yeah. Because sometimes you think of it for the first time. If you don't plan everything, that spontaneity, like, I'm glad it shows because I never do. I'll read back a set and have no idea what I'm going to say. It just goes. And to me, that's the way to do it because otherwise it sounds scripted. You can tell when someone's reading. You just can't.
Right.
And if you kind of know it already, why read it? I'll remind myself, but you just kind of let it go. And always remember, someone's just driving to work. They just want to get there. You don't want to give them too much. You don't want to give them too little, too, because they wait for you to come back on and talk. They know the songs. Some people want to hear what you have to say. So it's just a little balancing act. But if you listen to radio a lot, you're a fan of it, it just kind of comes natural. This is why Quentin Tarantino made movies. He said, I watched so many movies, I knew how to make a movie. Like, it's true. Like, if you listen to enough records and really understand production and what's going on with the instruments and stuff, when it was time to make our own records, we kind of knew what to do. We instinctively knew what to do. We'd never been in a studio. We never made a record, but we kind of knew from listening to so many records, like, we're going to start with the bass. You're going to come in with the piano and the verse. Like, you kind of just instinctively know. And then once you do it, then you learn it. It works out well for some people.
Yeah. Favorite Beatles song that you think people don't think of when someone goes favorite Beatles song? Like the best one, like, oh, this is a great song, but just people don't talk about it.
Yeah. There's a few that fall into that category. I think Cry Baby Cry is a really great John Lennon song that no one gives any credit to. Cry Baby Cry, I love that. I love Sexy Sadie and Dear Prudence. Dear Prudence obviously a lot more popular than the other two, but all three of those songs are cut from the same cloth, descending chords, White Album era, great John. I think while I respect Paul and I love him, when I put together my favorite Beatles songs, the majority of them are John songs. Interesting, no matter what album I look at.
Has that always been the case?
Yeah, and it's subconscious. It's not anything like I planned, but like I could look at Revolver and I go, I'm Only Sleeping, or I love that song, or I look at Rubber Soul, Girl. I love Girl. I love, In My Life, obviously. It's a classic. I love The Word. I love Wait. Those kind of weird songs that no one's like, The Word. I love The Word from Rubber Soul. It's another song no one, like you said, that no one talks about ever. The Word, great song, great radio song. It's a go-to song for me. Hey Bulldog, another song that John said it was a good sounding record that meant nothing. Well, most songs mean nothing at the end of the day. What does it mean? It's just a bunch of words from a guy who wrote them. What are they supposed to mean? So Hey Bulldog means as much to me as anything. It's great. It's a great riff. It's a great recording. And, no one would ever put that on their favorite. My favorite Beatles song is Hey Bulldog, but I love it. I also think in terms of radio, I know when I play The Word or I play Hey Bulldog or certain other songs, Savoy Truffle, certain songs instantly get attention because they're good. They jump right out at you. They're good radio songs. And then you balance those with songs that might be a little different that don't jump out at you. So when you're putting sets together, you go do that. You don't want to hit them every single time. You want to go peaks and valleys a little bit.
Yeah, the reason I asked is I think like growing up, I was probably a Paul McCartney leaned. And then as I grew older, I think I started to really love George Harrison more. But I think the thing that actually got me, I think, hooked on the Beatles was the Imagine movie. Because I remember seeing that, and I was probably always a fan and enjoyed, but seeing the Imagine movie, I mean, it was like a moment for me. And like then getting the soundtrack and just listening and discovering, because I don't think I had really kept up at that point with a lot of the solos, right? And so like some of those songs that John did.
Well, the first 3 years of the post-Beatles, 70, 71, 72, 73, are almost extensions of the Beatles because all the John songs from Imagine and the Plastic Ono Band, Paul songs on Ram and McCartney, they're all Beatles songs. They're all from January 69. They're all from India. Give Me Some Truth, Backseat of My Car, Another Day. You can go on and on. Give Me Some Truth. They're all done in India. So those first 3 years are exceptional. I love them as much as the Beatle years. I think 1970 is my favorite Beatle year of all the Beatle years. And it was the year they broke up. But if you look, 1970, they put out more music in 1970 than any other year of their career. It was a crazy year. Just look at the records released in that 1 year.
Oh, yeah, it's incredible. I don't want to not give Ringo kudos for Photograph and It Don't Come Easy. Those are two songs when they come on, I can stop what I'm doing and listening to those. For some reason, those two Ringo songs get me every time. I love them.
They're both written by George primarily.
See, I love George. See,
George is in that zone. I mean, look at George. I mean, George is in a band with the two greatest songwriters of the 20th century, right? And now in 24, or 2023, I should say, really. his song, Here Comes the Sun, is the most downloaded and streamed Beatles song of all Beatles songs, which George would have just loved if he was alive to see that, because his whole life he's dealing with John and Paul, right? And
Yeah, I know,
all
right?
the Beatles songs, his. And if that wasn't enough, I believe the top 10 streamed Beatles songs, George has 3 in the top 10, because Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps is in there with Here Comes the Sun. So out of the 10 most streamed, George has got 3. That's amazing.
I think when John died, it was tragic. When George died, one of the things that came out of it, the tribute song when they did with Petty and Prince comes on and they do While My Guitar Gently Weeps. It's probably one of the, I can't, like, if I'm scrolling and I come up, I can't not watch it.
Prince waits to the end, before you watch him throughout the song, he's kind of in the back and then he comes out, does the solo and he throws the guitar. I mean, it's one of the greatest performances of all time, one of the great rock and roll performances. Yeah.
Well, Chris Carter, thank you so much for spending all this time with me. I really appreciate it. I've loved listening to you on Breakfast with the Beatles, and I've loved talking to you. So thank you for sharing the stories with me and all you do. Keep the Beatles going.
Thanks for having me, man. I will. Peace and love, as Ringo would say.
Peace and love. All right. How amazing was Chris Carter? It was so amazing talking Fab Four with Chris Carter. Hope you enjoyed our Beatle chat. Definitely check out Chris Carter on Sirius XM, Breakfast with the Beatles. Make that part of your morning drive tradition, if it isn't already. Well, huge thank you again to Chris Carter. And of course, another huge thank you to all of you for coming back week after week. It means the world to me, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Classic Conversations. If you like what you heard, don't be shy and give us a follow on your favorite podcast app. Also, why not go ahead and tell all your friends about the show? You strike us as the kind of person that people listen to. Thanks in advance for spreading the word, and we'll catch you next time on Classic Conversations.